In the sun-scorched valleys of the American frontier, a deadly mistake is about to be made. 6 bandits, drunk on whiskey and their own reputation, spot what appears to be an easy mark. A weathered miner, trudging along a lonely trail with his pack mule. They don't know that the worn leather holster on his hip once belonged to the fastest gun in the Dakota Territory, claimed in a blood-soaked duel that left 20 men dead in the streets of Deadwood. They can't see the haunted look in his eyes, the kind that comes from being the only man walking away from a killing field. The man they're about to rob isn't just another prospector. He's Thomas "Deadeye" Morrison, the sole survivor of the infamous Golden Creek Massacre, where rival gangs turned a peaceful mining town into a graveyard over a claim dispute. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dawn broke over Silver Creek with its usual reluctance, painting the weathered buildings in shades of dusty gold. Thomas Morrison had already been awake for hours, loading his pack mule with the methodical precision that marked everything he did. The beast, a contrary old thing he called Judge, watched him with knowing eyes that had seen too many lonely trails. The locals knew better than to bother Morrison when he was preparing for a prospecting trip. They'd learned early on that the quiet man who lived in the cabin at the edge of town preferred solitude to conversation. Still, Sarah Fletcher from the general store made it her business to ensure he had enough supplies before each journey. She was perhaps the only person in Silver Creek who'd earned something close to trust from the weathered prospector. "Mr. Morrison," she called out, her boots crunching on the gravel, "got those coffee beans you wanted?" She held up a brown paper package, keeping her distance as she always did. The way Morrison's hand never strayed far from his hip hadn't gone unnoticed. Thomas nodded, reaching for his coin purse with his left hand, never his right. "Appreciate it, Miss Fletcher." His voice was rough from disuse, like boots on loose shale. He counted out the coins with deliberate care, the same way he did everything else. Sarah had heard the whispers about Thomas Morrison. Everyone in Silver Creek had. They said he'd come from up Dakota way, where the winters were harsh and the men harsher. Some claimed he'd been in law enforcement, others swore he'd run with outlaws. But the thing that made him interesting wasn't the rumors. It was the way he carried himself, like a man who'd seen the devil and learned his tricks. The holster on his hip drew attention without trying. It wasn't the typical worn leather most men carried. This one was crafted from premium leather, with intricate tooling that spoke of wealth and status. The gun it held was equally distinctive, a Colt single-action army with pearl grips, far too fine a weapon for a simple prospector. The combination of man and weapon carried an unspoken warning that even the drunkest cowboys heeded. "Planning to be gone long?" Sarah asked, watching as he secured the coffee with the rest of his supplies. "Week, maybe 2. Morrison checked Judge's straps one final time, following a promising vein up near Rattlesnake Ridge. Sarah's expression tightened. "That's Blackjack Taylor's territory these days. His boys have been causing trouble for other prospectors." Morrison's eyes met hers for a brief moment, and Sarah felt a chill despite the morning warmth. There was something in that gaze that reminded her of a mountain lion she'd once seen, patient, predatory, and absolutely certain of its capabilities. "Appreciate the warning," he said simply, but his hand brushed the pearl-handled Colt in what might have been habit or reassurance. As Thomas led Judge away from the general store, the morning sun caught the silver star pattern etched into his holster's leather. Sarah had always wondered about that detail. It wasn't the kind of adornment a miner would choose. Like everything else about Thomas Morrison, it hinted at a history written in blood and gun smoke. The trail out of Silver Creek wound past the cemetery, where wooden crosses stood in crooked rows. Morrison touched the brim of his hat as he passed, a gesture of respect that seemed at odds with his hardened demeanor. Some said he spent more time talking to the dead than the living. though no one knew which graves drew his attention. The morning stretched on as Morrison and Judge made their way into the hills. He kept to a steady pace, eyes constantly scanning the terrain ahead. Years of experience had taught him that survival depended on reading the land as much as reading men. A disturbed pattern of rocks could mean a recent rock slide, or it could mean someone trying to hide their tracks. By midday, the sun had burned away the last traces of morning cool. Morrison paused at a familiar outcropping, letting Judge drink from a clear stream while he checked his maps. The weathered papers showed careful annotations in a steady hand, marking promising claims and dangerous territories with equal precision. He'd added Blackjack Taylor's recent movements in red ink, tracking the outlaw's pattern like a hunter studying prey. As he folded the maps away, Morrison's fingers traced the grip of his Colt. The pearl was warm from the sun, but he could still feel the ghost of cold metal from that day in Golden Creek, the day he'd claimed this gun, along with the responsibility it represented. Sometimes, in the quiet moments like these, he could still hear Marshal Wade's last words, whispered through blood-stained lips. "Make it count, son, make every bullet count." Thomas Morrison had been counting ever since, counting bullets, counting bodies, counting the cost of survival. And now, as he led Judge deeper into contested territory, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd be adding to that tally soon enough. The sun was setting when Morrison's memories ambushed him. It happened whenever he passed the old lightning-struck pine that marked the trail to Golden Creek. The dying light painted the clouds blood red, just like that day 5 years ago, and suddenly he wasn't on the trail to Rattlesnake Ridge anymore. He was back in Golden Creek when it was still a living town. He remembered Mary Chen's laundry fluttering in the spring breeze, white sheets like surrender flags. Old Pete Thompson hammering away at his anvil, the rhythm of honest work echoing through peaceful streets, the Powell brothers arguing good-naturedly over property lines while their children played in the dusty road. Sheriff Mason sitting in his rocking chair, whittling and watching the town with eyes that missed nothing. Golden Creek had been different then. The gold was good, the claims were clear, and the law held steady. Morrison had a real claim, worked it honest with his own hands, even had himself a cabin with actual glass in the windows, a luxury he'd earned through 3 years of backbreaking work. He'd been Thomas back then, not yet Deadeye Morrison, just another prospector trying to carve out a piece of the American dream. Then the Hawkins gang rode in from the north, all swagger and greed, their saddlebags heavy with Dakota territory. Gold and their consciences light as feathers. They'd heard about the rich strikes in Golden Creek, and they weren't interested in doing the work themselves. Not when they could simply take what others had built, but they weren't the only ones. The Carson boys had already staked their claim on the town's future, running protection rackets and skimming from the miners' successes. 2 predatory forces, circling what they saw as easy prey. Sheriff Mason had seen it coming. "Powder kegs. Got a short fuse," he'd told Morrison one evening, cleaning his rifle with practiced care. "Might be time for folks to choose sides." But Morrison had wanted no part of it. He'd seen enough violence in his younger days, wore the scars to prove it. Judge's snort brought Morrison back to the present. The mule had stopped, ears twitching at something in the growing darkness. Morrison's hand found his Colt, the pearl grip as familiar as a handshake. 5 years had passed, but his reflexes were still honed by that day's events. He could smell it sometimes, gun smoke and blood mixing with the morning dew. Could hear the first shot that started it all. Probably an accident, maybe just some fool, trying to prove something. But it didn't matter how it started. What mattered was how it ended. 27 dead in less than an hour. The Hawkins gang and the Carson boys had turned Golden Creek's main street into a killing ground. Miners caught in the crossfire, women trying to reach their children, old men too stubborn to run. The bullets hadn't discriminated. Marshal Wade had arrived too late to prevent the bloodshed, but just in time to die saving Morrison's life. The Marshal had known what was coming, had tried to warn the town. Now his gun rode on Morrison's hip, a constant reminder of debts that could never be repaid. As twilight deepened into true darkness, Morrison made camp beneath the twisted pine. He'd learned long ago that running from memories only made them chase harder. Better to face them, learn from them, let them sharpen your edges rather than wear them down. He built a small fire, just enough to heat coffee and beans. Judge settled. Nearby, always alert for trouble. The mule had been with him that day too, had carried him out of Golden Creek when it was all over. Some nights, Morrison wondered if Judge remembered it as clearly as he did. Tomorrow, they'd reach Rattlesnake Ridge, where Blackjack Taylor's boys were supposedly camped. Another gang, thinking they could take whatever they wanted. Morrison touched the Marshal's gun, feeling the weight of all it represented. He hadn't gone looking for trouble back in Golden Creek, but he'd learned his lesson well. Sometimes trouble found you whether you wanted it or not. The trick was being ready when it did. Morrison sat by the dying fire, the pearl-handled Colt resting in his lap as he cleaned it with practiced precision. Every night, the same ritual. Every night, the same memories. His hands moved over the weapon with the reverence of a preacher, handling scripture, each motion exact, each detail attended to with unwavering focus. The gun had belonged to Marshal James Wade, and before that, to Wade's father. 3 generations of lawmen had carried it, used it to dispense justice across territories where law was often just a word in a book. The pearl grips were yellowed with age, smooth from years of handling. If you looked closely, you could see the subtle wear where 3 different trigger fingers had rested. A gun's just a tool, son, Wade had told him once, back when Morrison was still learning the weight of responsibility. But this one's got history. Every notch on the grip is a lesson learned, every scratch a story of what happens when words ain't enough. Morrison could recite those lessons now, had learned them the hard way in Golden Creek. The Marshal had been teaching him for months before the massacre, seeing something in the quiet prospector that reminded him of his younger self. Wade had been the one to notice Morrison's natural talent with a pistol, the way he could read a situation before it turned deadly. "You've got the eye," Wade had said after watching Morrison put 6 shots through a row of bottles at 50 paces. "And more importantly, you've got the patience. Most men with your skill would be showing it off in every saloon from here to Kansas City. But you understand what it means to hold back." The lessons had started small. How to read a man's intentions from the way he carried himself. How to spot the difference between a braggart and a real killer. The proper way to diffuse a situation before it turned deadly. Wade had been preparing him, though neither of them knew it at the time. "There's 2 kinds of fast in this world." Wade's voice echoed in Morrison's memory as he reassembled the Colt with meticulous care. "There's the kind that gets you noticed in gambling halls, and there's the kind that keeps you breathing when everything goes wrong. I'm teaching you the second kind." The day of the massacre, Wade had been 2 hours away when the shooting started. He'd ridden hard when he heard, but by the time he reached Golden Creek, the street was already littered with bodies. Morrison had been pinned down behind the ruins of Mary Chen's laundry, surrounded by Hawkins' men who'd already killed 3 miners. Wade didn't hesitate. He rode straight into the kill zone, drawing fire from both gangs. His distraction had given Morrison the chance he needed, but it had cost the Marshal his life. 3 bullets found him before he could reach cover. Morrison could still see it with perfect clarity. Wade, propped against a water trough, blood spreading across his chest. The Marshal's last act had been to press his prized Colt into Morrison's hands. "Make it count," he'd whispered. "Make every bullet count." And Morrison had. 7 shots later, the street had fallen silent. 7 perfect shots, each one finding its mark through smoke and chaos. The gun had felt like it belonged in his hand, like all of Wade's lessons had been leading to this moment. Now, as Morrison finished cleaning the weapon, he held it up to catch the last light of the fire. The silver star pattern on the holster matched the one Wade had worn as marshal. Morrison had commissioned it special, a tribute to the man who'd taught him that wearing a gun meant carrying the weight of every life it took or saved. Judge shifted uneasily in the darkness, sensing something his human companion hadn't yet noticed. Morrison's hands stilled on the weapon. Wade's final lesson was about to be put to the test. Something was moving in the night, trying to be quiet, trying to be careful. But Morrison had learned from the best, and he knew exactly what it meant when the night held its breath. Slowly, deliberately, he holstered the Colt. Wade's gun was about to write another chapter in its long history. Morrison only hoped he could live up to the legacy that came with it. The bandits moved through the pre-dawn darkness, like wolves circling prey, their confidence growing with each step. 6 men, each convinced that numbers alone made them invincible. Their leader, a scarred man who called himself Red Jack, had spent the night watching Morrison's camp from the ridgeline, counting on the miner's routine to be his undoing. "Remember," Red Jack whispered to his men, "he's just some old prospector. Probably ain't even fired that fancy gun of his in years." He didn't mention the unease he'd felt watching Morrison clean his weapon the night before. There had been something about those movements, something that scratched at the back of his mind like a warning. Morrison was already awake when they started their approach, had been since the first bird fell silent in the false dawn. He kept, his breathing steady, his body relaxed against his saddle as he pretended to sleep. Judge's periodic snorts told him everything he needed to know about the bandits' positions. The mule's ears were better than any lookout. Red Jack positioned his men with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this dozens of times before. 2 men on either side, himself and his best shooter approaching from the front. Standard practice for overwhelming a lone traveler. But there was nothing standard about their target. The first hint that something was wrong came when Morrison spoke without opening his eyes. "You boys might want to reconsider your next move." His voice carried clearly in the morning stillness, calm as a priest's benediction. Red Jack froze mid-step, thrown off by the precise warning. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Their targets weren't supposed to know they were coming, weren't supposed to sound so damn sure of themselves. "And now, friend," Red Jack tried to salvage the situation, forcing confidence into his voice, "no need for this to get messy. We're just here to relieve you of any excess weight you might be carrying. Gold's mighty heavy for one man to transport." Morrison's eyes opened then, and Red Jack felt his certainty waver. Those weren't a miner's eyes looking back at him. They were a executioner's eyes, patient and calculating, already measuring the distance to each target. "Last warning," Morrison said, still not moving from his relaxed position. "Walk away now, and we can all pretend this was just a bad dream." One of Red Jack's men, a young hothead named Billy, laughed nervously. "6 against 1, old man. You ain't exactly in a position to be making threats." Morrison sighed, a sound heavy with resignation. "Numbers don't mean much to a dead man's gun." The words triggered something in Red Jack's memory. Stories he'd heard, whispered in saloons across 3 territories. Stories about a massacre in a mining town, about a lawman's weapon passed on in blood, about a man they called Deadeye. "Hold up, boys," Red Jack started to say, but it was too late. Billy, young and stupid and scared of looking weak, went for his gun. The next few seconds were a lesson in the difference between speed and skill. Morrison's draw was almost lazy, a smooth motion that seemed almost reluctant. But the Colt cleared leather before Billy's fingers touched his grip, and the young bandit was dead before he realized his mistake. The morning exploded into chaos. Red Jack dove for cover behind a boulder as his men opened fire, their shots wild. And panicked. Morrison's return fire was methodical, each shot placed with surgical precision. Two more bandits fell in rapid succession, their bodies crumpling like marionettes with cut strings. "Hold your fire!" Red Jack screamed, trying to regain control of the situation. But his remaining men were beyond listening, their fear overwhelming. Their training. They kept shooting, kept missing, while Morrison picked them apart with the patience of a man who had all the time in the world. 5 shots, 5 bodies. The entire exchange had taken less than 30 seconds, and Red Jack found himself alone, pressed against his boulder, listening to the echo of gunfire fade into the mountains. His remaining bullets felt worthless in his gun, like lead weights dragging him down. "Just you left." Morrison's voice came from somewhere to his right. The man had moved during the shooting, silent as a ghost. "And I've got 1 bullet left." "Seems fitting, don't you think?" Red Jack's mind raced. He'd led crews against settlers, miners, even lawmen, but this was different. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was an ambush in reverse, a predator who'd let them walk right into his sights. "Wait," Red Jack called out, desperation cracking his voice. "You don't understand. We were sent here, paid good money to find you." The silence that followed was heavy with promise. When Morrison spoke again, his voice was closer, carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. "Now that's interesting. Who'd be foolish enough to pay for something like that?" "Man named Carson," Red Jack said quickly, hoping the information would buy him time. "Marcus Carson. Said you owed him for something that happened in Golden Creek. Said his brother died there." The wind picked up, carrying the smell of gunsmoke and death across the campsite. Judge watched impassively as Morrison stepped into view, Wade's Colt aimed steady at Red Jack's head. There was no mercy in his stance, no hesitation in his trigger finger. "Carson," Morrison repeated the name like a curse. "Should have known. He'd try something like this eventually. Thank you for the information." The Colt's hammer clicked back. That last bullet spoken for now. Red Jack closed his eyes, understanding finally what it meant to face a man who'd already died once, who'd been reborn in blood and gunsmoke. The last thing he heard was the sound of Wade's gun keeping its promises. The morning sun climbed higher as Morrison methodically searched the bodies. Each man carried the usual belongings: ammunition, a few dollars in coin, tobacco. But it was the newer items that held his attention. Fresh supplies from Silver Creek's general store, quality ammunition purchased within the last week. They'd been preparing, watching, waiting for their chance. He found what he was looking for in Red Jack's coat pocket, a folded letter written in a flowing hand that spoke of Eastern education. The paper was expensive, the kind Marcus Carson had always favored. Morrison read it twice, committing every word to memory before feeding it to the remnants of his campfire. "Should have known you'd survive." The voice came from behind him. Billy, the young hothead, wasn't quite dead. Blood bubbled from his chest with each labored breath. "Carson, he said you was dangerous, but—" Morrison knelt beside the dying man, not out of mercy, but necessity. "Tell me about Carson. Everything." "Gathered. 2 weeks ago," Billy coughed, red staining his lips. "Said his brother died in some mining town. Said you killed him. Offered good money to bring you down." His eyes were growing distant. "Didn't say nothing about you being Deadeye Morrison." "Your boss figured it out too late," Morrison said quietly. "Carson should have told you what you were walking into." Billy managed a weak laugh that turned into a gurgle. "Wouldn't have mattered. Red Jack never backed down from—" His words trailed off as death finally claimed him. Morrison stood slowly, his joints protesting the morning chill. 6 bodies to bury. He wouldn't leave them for the scavengers, no matter what they'd done. Wade had taught him that much. Every man deserved a grave, even if they didn't deserve the prayers that came with it. As he worked, Judge watched from the edges of the camp, occasionally snorting at the smell of death that hung in the air. The mule had seen this before, back in Golden Creek, had helped Morrison bury bodies then, too. The sun was high when Morrison finished the last grave. No markers, no crosses, just 6 mounds of earth that would soon be reclaimed by the wilderness. He cleaned Wade's gun one more time, though it didn't need it. Some habits were about more than necessity. Marcus Carson, he spoke the name to the empty air, testing its weight. 5 years ago, Carson's brother had been one of the instigators at Golden Creek, one of the men who'd turned a claim dispute into a bloodbath. Morrison hadn't killed him. That particular honor had gone to one of the Hawkins gang in the chaos. But Carson had never been one to care about details like truth. The letter had mentioned Rattlesnake Ridge, but Morrison knew better than to trust that direction now. Carson was smart, educated, ruthless. He'd want to watch his plan unfold, would want to see Morrison's death with his own eyes. That meant he was close. Morrison packed his gear with the same methodical care he always showed, but there was a new tension in his movements. The familiar weight of Wade's gun at his hip seemed heavier now, charged with purpose. Carson had made his first move, had shown his hand. Now it was Morrison's turn. He mounted up, nudging Judge away from their grim campsite. The trail ahead led through narrow canyons and treacherous slopes, perfect country for ambush. But Morrison had learned long ago that the best way to spring a trap was to walk into it knowingly, to turn your enemy's advantage into a weakness. As they rode, Morrison's mind drifted back to Golden Creek, to the lessons learned in blood and fire. He'd been passive then, had tried to stay neutral until it was too late. Wade had died because of that hesitation. This time would be different. This time Morrison wasn't just surviving, he was hunting. The dead man's gun rode easy on his hip, ready for whatever came next. Carson wanted to finish what his brother had started in Golden Creek. Instead, he'd learn why some ghosts were better left unavenged. The terrain grew rougher as Morrison guided Judge through a maze of weathered canyons. Here, the wind had carved the rock into strange shapes, creating shadows that could hide a dozen men. Every corner, every ridge, every narrow pass was a potential ambush point, but that worked both ways. He found the first sign of Carson's presence near a dried-up waterfall, the remains of a coffee fire no more than 2 days old. Expensive grounds, the kind only Carson would insist on even while plotting. Murder. Morrison knelt by the ashes, rubbing them between his fingers. The man's Eastern refinement had always been at odds with his capacity for violence. Getting sloppy, Marcus, Morrison muttered, noting the distinctive pattern of horseshoes in the hardpack. Carson still rode thoroughbreds, status symbols that were ill-suited for mountain work. The tracks told a story, at least 4 horses moving carefully, trying to stay hidden but betrayed by their quality. Judge's ears suddenly pricked forward, and Morrison froze. Years of partnership had taught him to trust the mule's instincts. Something was moving up on the ridgeline, disturbing loose shale in a pattern too regular to be natural. Morrison led Judge into a shallow cave, watching as small rocks tumbled. Down the canyon wall, a man appeared briefly against the sky, young, well-dressed, carrying a spyglass, one of Carson's scouts. The man swept the glass across the canyon floor, searching methodically. Morrison stayed perfectly still in the shadows, counting seconds. The scout was good, professional, but he was looking for movement. He'd never spot. Someone who knew how to become part of the rock. When the scout disappeared back over the ridge, Morrison allowed himself a grim smile. Carson was running a sophisticated operation. Scouts, relay positions, probably signal mirrors to coordinate. His men. This wasn't just revenge, it was a carefully planned military operation. Carson had learned from his brother's mistakes at Golden Creek. Morrison pulled out his own spyglass, studying the ridgelines. There, a flash of light from a mirror, about 2 miles north, and another, answering from the east. Carson was boxing him in, using the terrain to funnel him toward Rattlesnake Ridge. The same strategy the army had used against the Apaches, if Morrison remembered his history right. But Carson had made one critical mistake. He assumed Morrison would try to avoid the trap, would look for a way around or through. He didn't understand that Morrison had been setting his own trap since the moment Red Jack's men had died. Sometimes, the best way to hunt a hunter was to play the prey. Judge snorted softly as Morrison led him deeper into the canyon. The mule understood. They weren't running, weren't hiding. They were choosing their ground. Up ahead, the canyon narrowed into a natural bottleneck, with high walls that would give a skilled shooter perfect angles on anyone below. It was exactly the kind of place Carson would want to drive him toward. Morrison touched the pearl grip of Wade's gun, feeling the familiar smoothness under his fingers. The marshal had taught him about this kind of fighting, about using an enemy's expectations against them. The trick, Wade had said, isn't just knowing where they want you to go, it's making them think you don't know. As the sun began to set, Morrison made camp in plain sight of the canyon walls. He built a fire bigger than usual, opened a can of beans with deliberate noise. To anyone watching, he looked like a man unaware of the noose tightening around him. But every piece of his gear was arranged for quick access, every escape route already memorized. In the growing darkness, Morrison imagined Carson in his own camp, probably enjoying imported coffee and expensive cigars while his men reported their progress. The man had always loved his comforts, even during the worst days in Golden Creek. That tendency to privilege himself while others did the dirty work would be his undoing. Tomorrow would bring blood. Morrison knew it as surely as he knew the sun would rise. Carson's men would make their move, would try to push him into their carefully planned kill zone. And Morrison would let them, would play the part of the desperate quarry right up until the moment he turned the hunt around. The dead man's gun waited patiently at his side. Soon, it would add more lessons to its long history of teaching foolish men about the price of underestimating its bearer. Morrison's dreams that night took him back to Golden Creek, to the last peaceful morning before everything went wrong. He could see it all with perfect clarity. The way the sunrise painted the mountain peaks in shades of amber and gold, the smell of fresh bread from Miller's bakery, the sound of picks striking stone from the nearby claims. Young Jimmy Carson had been the first to die that day. Not from violence, but from foolishness. He'd been showing off his new pistol in front of Sarah's saloon, twirling it like he'd seen fancy shootists do. The gun had gone off, the bullet striking a water barrel. A stupid accident that should have ended with nothing more than embarrassment. And a few harsh words. But Marcus Carson didn't see it that way. When the Hawkins gang started laughing at his brother's clumsiness, Marcus had taken it as a personal insult to the Carson family name. Words were exchanged, threats made, and suddenly both gangs were squaring off in the street while the townspeople scurried for cover. Morrison had been in his claim when he heard the first real shots. He remembered dropping his pick, grabbing his old Remington revolver and running toward town. Marshal Wade had warned him this was coming, had tried to get him to wear a deputy's badge. But Morrison had refused, thinking he could stay neutral, thinking his reputation as a fair man would keep him out of the trouble. "Your problem, son," Wade had told him, "is you think staying out of trouble means trouble will stay out of you. Sometimes a man's got to choose his side before the choice gets made for him." By the time Morrison reached the edge of town, the street had turned into a war zone. Jimmy Carson lay dead in the dust, not from his own foolishness, but from a Hawkins bullet. Marcus was using the Undertaker's shoppe as a firing position, coordinating his men with cold precision while tears streaked his face. The Hawkins gang had taken cover behind overturned wagons and water troughs. Their superior numbers spread out to control the street. But they hadn't counted on Marcus Carson's military education, on his ability to turn a spontaneous gunfight into a coordinated assault. Morrison had tried to reach the sheriff's office, thinking he could still help restore order. That's when He saw Wade riding hard into town, his badge catching the morning sun. The marshal had known somehow that today would be the day. He'd tried one last time to prevent the bloodshed, riding straight down the middle of the street with his hands raised. "This ends now." Wade's voice had carried over the gunfire. "Everyone drops their weapons," or the rest of his words were lost in a new volley of shots. Nobody knew who fired first. The Carsons claiming it was the Hawkins gang, the Hawkins survivors swearing it was the Carsons. It didn't matter. Wade's horse went down, and the real killing started. Morrison found himself pinned down behind Mary Chen's laundry, watching helplessly as the town tore itself apart. Good people caught in the crossfire, trying to escape or help others, cut down, without mercy. He saw Marcus Carson shoot 3 Hawkins men with military precision, saw the Hawkins gang respond by setting fire to buildings with people still inside. Then Wade was there, somehow still alive after his horse went down. The marshal had fought his way to Morrison's position, using the chaos to move unseen. His gun, the pearl-handled Colt, had spoken 6 times on the way, each shot finding its mark. "Time to choose, son," Wade had said, pressing spare ammunition into Morrison's hands. Those bastards aren't leaving anyone alive to tell tales. The next few minutes were a blur of smoke and thunder. Wade moving to draw fire, giving Morrison the chance to flank the Hawkins positions. The cold clarity that came over him as he realized this wasn't about justice anymore. It was about survival. The weight of Wade's gun in his hand after the marshal fell, and the terrible efficiency with which he used it. Morrison woke from the memory with his hand on Wade's Colt. The eastern sky was starting to lighten, promising another clear day. In a few hours, he'd face more killing, but this time would be different. This time he wasn't an unwilling participant caught in someone else's war. This time, he was the one setting the terms of engagement. Judge watched as Morrison checked his gear one final time. The mule had been there too, had carried Morrison out of Golden Creek when it was over. Now, 5 years later, they were both about to write the final chapter of that bloody story. Marcus Carson was about to learn that some debts could only be paid in blood. Dawn brought the hunters, just as Morrison had expected. They moved like soldiers, maintaining proper intervals, checking sightlines. 4 men working their way down the canyon walls, while others watched from above. Carson had trained them well. They were professionals, not common bandits like Red Jack's crew. Morrison let them see him break camp, made a show of being startled when a loose rock clattered down the canyon wall. He mounted Judge quickly, as if panicked, and headed deeper, into the narrowing passage. Behind him, he heard the subtle sounds of pursuit. Horses moving carefully, men trying to be quiet and mostly succeeding. The canyon walls rose higher with each passing minute, turning the morning light into twilight. Morrison had spent the night, memorizing every feature, every possible position. Now he counted under his breath as he rode, measuring distance by Judge's steady pace. The mule understood their game, had played it before in other times, other places, 300 yards to the first position. Morrison touched Wade's gun, feeling the reassurance of cold steel. The pursuers were closer now, growing confident as they sensed their quarry's apparent fear. They didn't notice how the canyon floor had subtly changed, how loose rocks and gravel had given way to bare stone that wouldn't hold tracks. At 200 yards, Morrison heard the first signal mirror clicking above, Carson's men coordinating their final push. He smiled grimly. They were using the sun to communicate, but they'd forgotten that those same mirrors could betray their positions to a careful observer. 5 men on the ridgeline, plus the 4 following, 9 total, leaving at least 3 in reserve probably. With Carson himself, 100 yards. The canyon narrowed dramatically here, forcing his pursuers to bunch up. Morrison could hear them discussing strategy in low voices, professional enough to maintain discipline, but not quite quiet enough to avoid detection. They were good, he had to admit, just not good enough. This is your last chance, a voice called out, firm and commanding. Surrender now, and Mr. Carson will ensure you receive a quick death. Morrison reined Judge to a stop. This was the spot he'd chosen, a natural amphitheater with walls that rose nearly vertical for 60 feet. No way up or down, except the trail behind them. To Carson's men, it must have looked like they'd trapped their prey perfectly. Mighty generous of him. Morrison called back, his voice echoing off the stone. But I've got a counter-offer. He dismounted slowly, patting Judge's flank. The mule knew what to do, moving to a protected alcove with unhurried steps. There's no way out, the voice responded. You're only prolonging the inevitable. Morrison drew Wade's gun with deliberate care, making sure the pearl grips caught the light. Ask your boss about Golden Creek. Ask him how many men thought they had me trapped there. A moment of silence followed, then hurried whispers as the name registered. Morrison used their distraction to move, sliding into the first of the positions. He'd prepared during the night. Above him, the signal mirrors had stopped clicking. They were waiting for orders, suddenly unsure. You're lying, the voice said, but there was doubt in it now. Deadeye Morrison died at Golden Creek, everyone knows that. Stories get twisted, Morrison answered, his voice seeming to come from a different direction. The canyon's acoustics were perfect for deception. Truth is, I walked out of Golden Creek, just like I'm going to walk out of here. A shot rang out, someone's nerves finally breaking. The bullet whined off stone far from Morrison's position. He didn't return fire. Not yet. Let them waste ammunition. Let them reveal their positions. Wade had taught him patience in gunfights, just as surely as he'd taught him speed. Last chance to walk away, Morrison called out. Tell Carson his brother died fair. Tell him to let old ghosts rest. The answer came in a volley of shots, professional gunmen firing at shadows and echoes. Morrison waited, counting shots, listening to the different reports of each weapon. When he finally moved, it was with the certainty of a man who had choreographed every step of this dance. Wade's gun cleared leather one more time, ready to teach its deadly lessons. In the confined space of the canyon, the first shot rang out like thunder, promising violence to come. The first man died without ever seeing Morrison. One moment he was moving to a better position, the next he was falling, Wade's gun having found its mark with surgical precision. The sound of the shot bounced off the canyon walls, making it impossible for the others to locate its source. Scatter! The leader's voice cracked with urgency. He's using the echoes. But scattering was exactly what Morrison had planned for. In the confined space, Carson's men had limited options. Two tried to retreat back down the canyon, while the others pressed themselves against the walls, trying to make themselves smaller targets. Morrison moved like a ghost between the positions he'd prepared, using natural chimneys in the rock that he'd discovered during the night. Each location gave him a different angle, a new way to throw his voice, another chance to sow confusion. "He's up there!" someone shouted, firing at a shadow that might have been Morrison. The shots went wide, sparking off stone. Morrison answered with 2 rapid shots from Wade's Colt. 1 miss, 1 hit. Another man down. The remaining gunmen were professionals, and they adapted quickly. They stopped wasting ammunition on shadows, started coordinating their movements with hand signals. Up on the ridgeline, their companions were trying to find angles to help, but the canyon walls worked against them. Any shot at Morrison's potential positions risked hitting their own men below. "Carson didn't tell you everything, did he?" Morrison's voice echoed from somewhere above them. "Didn't tell you what really happened to his brother?" A bullet sparked near his head, closer this time. They were starting to understand his pattern, beginning to predict his movements. Morrison shifted positions again, dropping down behind a boulder as return fire chipped away at the rock. "Shut up and die!" One of the men had lost his professional demeanor, fear making him reckless. Morrison marked his position by the voice. "Jimmy Carson died by accident," Morrison continued, his words punctuated by the crack of Wade's gun. Another hit. He heard the grunt of pain, followed by the clatter of a dropped weapon. His own gun went off while he was showing off. Everything that followed was just his brother's pride. The leader of the group had gone quiet, which worried Morrison more than the ongoing gunfire. A professional who stopped talking was a professional who had figured something out. Morrison caught a glimpse of movement. The man was working his way toward Judge's position, thinking to flush Morrison out by threatening the mule. What he didn't know was that Judge was bait, carefully positioned to draw attention from Morrison's real killing ground. When the leader rounded the boulder near the mule, Morrison was waiting. Wade's gun barked twice, ending any chance of the man reaching Judge. The remaining gunmen realized their situation was untenable. Morrison heard them calling to their companions above, requesting covering fire for a retreat. But withdrawal from a prepared position was always dangerous, and Morrison had been counting on their eventual retreat. He hit them as they pulled back, catching one in the open while forcing the other to dive for inadequate cover. The man rolled behind a boulder, returning fire more to cover his escape than with any real hope of hitting Morrison. Up on the ridgeline, the watchers were pulling back too. They'd lost sight of their quarry and half their ground team. Professional. Pride warred with survival instinct, and survival won. Morrison listened to the sound of their withdrawal, marking their likely rally points for later. When silence finally settled over the canyon, Morrison did a careful count. 4 dead below, the rest scattered but likely regrouping. Carson would have positioned his reserves carefully, probably at both ends of the canyon system, ready to catch Morrison whichever way he ran. Judge ambled over as Morrison reloaded Wade's Colt. The mule's ears were still tracking something in the distance, the retreating gunman most likely. Morrison checked his ammunition. He'd used 7 rounds, each one carefully placed. Wade would have approved of the economy of action. "They'll be back," Morrison told Judge as he mounted up. "Carson won't let them retreat far. He'll want to salvage something from this operation." He patted the mule's neck. "But now they know what they're dealing with. Next time they'll be more careful. Next time they'll be scared." Morrison turned Judge toward the canyon's far end. Carson's remaining men would be waiting, but they'd be waiting for a frightened miner trying to escape. What they'd get instead was a hunter who had already turned their own trap against them once. Sometimes, Morrison reflected, the best way to spring a trap was to let it snap shut behind you. Morrison found a sheltered spot to rest Judge and check his gear. A natural hollow screened by scrub pine and rock. As he cleaned Wade's Colt, muscle memory brought back the marshal's voice, clear as if he was standing there in the afternoon. "Heat, a gun's not just a weapon, son. It's a responsibility." Wade had told him this during their first real conversation, after watching Morrison break up a saloon fight without drawing his revolver. Any fool can pull a trigger. The hard part is knowing when not to. Morrison checked his remaining ammunition, arranging it with precise care. He had enough for what was coming, but the marshal's lessons about economy still guided his actions. Each bullet was a decision that couldn't be taken back, a judgment that had to be weighed carefully. "You've got the look," Wade had said once, studying Morrison over a cup of coffee in Golden Creek's only cafe. "Same look I had after the war. Man who's seen too much but can't walk away from what needs doing." The marshal had been cleaning his pearl-handled Colt as he spoke, the same gun that now rode on Morrison's hip. "Question is, what are you going to do with that burden?" The afternoon wind whispered through the canyon, carrying the faint sounds of horses moving in the distance. Carson's men regrouping, probably. Morrison used the time to check Judge for any injuries, though he knew the mule was too smart to have caught a stray bullet. "Most men," Wade's memories continued, "they get a taste of violence and either run from it or embrace it. But there's a third type, the kind that learns to carry it like a tool, using it only when necessary. Those are the ones who make a difference." Morrison had tried to be that third type, had spent years in Golden Creek building something honest with his own hands. But violence had found him anyway, had torn his peaceful life apart, and left him with nothing but Wade's gun and a burden of memory. He checked his back trail carefully, noting signs that Carson's men had indeed split into two groups. They were being more cautious now, moving like men who'd learned a harsh lesson about underestimating their quarry. Good. Fear made men predictable, and predictable men made mistakes. The thing about justice, Wade had told him during their last conversation, before the massacre, is that it ain't always about the law. Sometimes it's about what's right, and sometimes a man has to decide that for himself. The marshal had been trying to convince Morrison to take a deputy's badge, to stop straddling the line between miner and lawman. World's got enough men willing to look the other way. What it needs is men willing to stand up. Morrison hadn't taken the badge. He'd wanted to believe that staying neutral would keep the peace, that his reputation as a fair man would help calm the tensions building in Golden Creek. Wade had seen clearer, had known that some conflicts couldn't be avoided, only faced. The sun was starting to descend, painting the canyon walls in deepening shades of red. Morrison studied the terrain ahead through his spyglass, marking likely ambush points and escape routes. Carson would have his remaining men positioned to control the high ground, probably with at least one sharpshooter covering the obvious paths. Thing about having the high ground, Wade had taught him, is that it makes men careless. They start thinking they're untouchable up there. That's when they forget to watch their flanks. Morrison allowed himself a grim smile as he spotted a flash of light from a rifle scope. Carson's sharpshooter was good, had picked an excellent position with clear lines of fire to the canyon floor, but he'd positioned himself against the setting sun, probably planning to use the light to his advantage in the morning. He hadn't considered that the same sun would betray his position to someone who knew what to look for. "Last thing I'm going to teach you," Wade had said that final morning, not knowing he'd be dead before sunset, "is that every man's got a choice. When the killing starts, you can either let it destroy you, or you can use it to protect something worth saving." Morrison checked Wade's gun one final time before holstering it. The marshal's lessons had kept him alive through Golden Creek and everything that followed. Now they would help him finish what Carson's pride had started, not for revenge, Wade had taught him better than that, but for justice, and for the peace that only comes when old debts are finally settled. Judge snorted softly, picking up on his rider's shift in mood. The mule knew what was coming. They'd been down this trail before, had seen how paths of violence always led to moments of decision. Morrison patted the animal's neck, gathering his resolve. It was time to show Carson's men what the marshal's last student had learned about justice and survival. The sun had almost disappeared behind the western ridges when Morrison spotted the campfire. It was well hidden in a box canyon, the kind of secure location a military man would choose, but the expensive tobacco smoke drifting on the evening. Air told him all he needed to know. Marcus Carson was there, waiting with his remaining men. Morrison left Judge secured in a protected hollow and moved forward on foot, using the growing shadows to his advantage. Carson's perimeter guards were alert but predictable, watching the obvious approaches while leaving small blind spots that an experienced man could exploit. Morrison slipped through their lines like a ghost, drawing closer to the voices carrying. "From the camp. Couldn't have known it was him," someone was saying. Dead-Eye Morrison was supposed to have died at Golden Creek. Everyone knew that. Everyone was wrong. Carson's voice carried the same cultured edge Morrison remembered, Eastern education wrapped around frontier steel. "I should have made sure of it myself, but there wasn't time, not with the marshal bleeding out and the town burning." Morrison froze in his concealed position. Something in Carson's tone, in the specific way he mentioned Wade's death, scratched at old memories. "But your brother," one of the men started. "My brother was a fool," Carson cut him off sharply, "but he was useful. His death gave me the excuse I needed." The Hawkins gang took the blame, the town burned, and no one ever looked too closely at the gold shipments that disappeared that day. Morrison's blood ran cold as pieces of a 5-year-old puzzle suddenly shifted into place. The Territorial Bank had never found the gold stored in Golden Creek's assay office. Everyone assumed it had been lost in the fire, or that the Hawkins gang had somehow taken it during the chaos. It was perfect, Carson continued, warming to his story. Jimmy's little accident with his gun gave me exactly what I needed. A reason to eliminate the Hawkins gang and anyone else who might have suspected what we'd been planning for months. The whole thing was a setup, another voice said quietly. The rivalry with Hawkins, the protection rackets, all of it. Pride colored Carson's voice. I spent 6 months positioning everyone exactly where I needed them. The Hawkins gang was easy to manipulate. Just threaten their territory, wound their pride, and they'd react exactly as expected. The hard part was keeping the marshal from catching on. Morrison's hand tightened on Wade's gun as the truth emerged. The marshal hadn't just suspected trouble was coming. He'd been investigating Carson all along. But Morrison survived, someone pointed out, and the marshal gave him that fancy gun of his. Yes. Carson's voice hardened. Wade was cleverer than I gave him credit for. He must have kept evidence somewhere, must have told Morrison something. Before he died, why else would he pass on his precious gun to a simple miner? Morrison remembered Wade's last moments differently. The marshal hadn't had time for revelations or evidence. He'd simply pressed his gun into Morrison's hands, trusting him to use it wisely. But now, Morrison wondered if the gun itself was the message. If Wade had known that Carson would recognize it, would worry about what secrets might have died with him. So all this, the first voice said carefully, the hired guns, the elaborate trap, it's not really about your brother at all. My brother died the moment he proved himself too incompetent to be useful, Carson said dismissively. This is about finishing what I started. Morrison's survival is a loose end I should have tied up years ago. The fact that he's carrying Wade's gun makes him doubly dangerous. Because of what Wade might have told him. Carson's laugh was cold. Because of what that gun represents. Every lawman in 3 territories knew Wade's Colt. As long as Morrison carries it, someone might start asking the right questions about Golden Creek. And I've worked too hard building my new empire to let that happen. Morrison had heard enough. The truth of Golden Creek was worse than he'd imagined. Not just a tragedy born of pride and circumstance, but a deliberately orchestrated massacre. Carson had used his own brother's death as a spark to light a fire that would cover his tracks and fill his pockets. As Morrison carefully retreated from the camp, he heard Carson giving orders for the next day's hunt. The man was still playing general, still moving pieces on his mental battlefield, but he'd made one critical mistake. He'd assumed Morrison was running from the truth, when in fact he'd been hunting it all along. Judge was waiting patiently when Morrison returned to their hidden camp. The mule's ears flicked forward as Morrison checked Wade's gun with hands that shook slightly from controlled rage. All these years, he'd carried the weight of Golden Creek's dead, thinking he could have somehow prevented the tragedy if he'd chosen differently. Now he knew the truth. They had all been Carson's pawns, pieces sacrificed in a game they never knew they were playing. Morrison touched the pearl grips of Wade's Colt, remembering all the lessons the marshal had taught him about justice and responsibility. Wade had seen something coming, had tried to investigate quietly while preparing Morrison for what might follow. He died not knowing the full scope of Carson's plot, but understanding enough to pass his gun to someone he trusted to carry on his work. The night grew deeper as Morrison made his plans. Carson had more men, better positions, and the confidence of a man who thought he controlled all the pieces on the board. But he'd forgotten the most important lesson Wade had ever taught Morrison. Sometimes justice came down to one man willing to stand against the odds, one gun in the hands of someone who understood the weight of responsibility it carried. Tomorrow. would bring a reckoning 5 years in the making. Carson would learn that some ghosts didn't rest, some debts couldn't be buried, and some guns carried a legacy that went beyond mere steel and powder. Morrison checked his ammunition one final time, each bullet a promise waiting to be kept. In the distance, Carson's campfire burned like a beacon, calling Morrison toward a confrontation that had been inevitable since the day Wade's gun changed hands. The truth of Golden Creek had finally emerged from the shadows, and with it came the certainty that only one man would walk away from this final act of a tragedy 5 years in the making. Dawn crept over the canyon rim like spilled blood, painting the rocks in shades of crimson. Morrison had been awake for hours, using the pre-dawn darkness to scout Carson's positions. The man's military training showed in the careful placement of his remaining forces. 2 sharpshooters on the high ground, 3 men guarding the obvious approaches, and at least 4 more in reserve near Carson's own position. Professionals, all of them. Men who killed for money rather than passion, or pride. That made them dangerous, but it also made them predictable. They'd fight as long as they were paid, but their loyalty had limits. Morrison intended to find those limits. He checked Wade's gun one final time, but his thoughts weren't on the weapon's mechanism. They were on the marshal's last investigation, on the clues Wade must have pieced together before Carson's scheme exploded into violence. The gun wasn't just a badge of office passed on in desperation. It was evidence in its own right, a symbol that Carson couldn't ignore. Judge watched quietly as Morrison made his preparations. No saddle today. The mule would play a different role in what was coming. Morrison packed his saddlebags with care, including items that would have seemed strange just yesterday. A bottle of lamp oil, Marshal Wade's badge that he'd carried but never worn, and the deed to his Golden Creek claim that had survived the fire. Carson thinks he knows what's coming, Morrison told Judge as he worked. Thinks I'm just another ghost from his past that needs burying. But Wade taught me something about men like him. He checked the loads in his spare revolver, the ordinary Remington that most people assumed was his only weapon. Men who build empires on betrayal spend the rest of their lives watching for knives in the dark. The sun climbed higher as Morrison put his plan into motion. First, he led Judge to a specific position, tying the mule's reins in a special way, loose enough to break free when needed. Then he began moving through the canyon system, using skills learned from years of prospecting to reach seemingly impossible positions. Carson's men were alert but confident in their coverage. They never thought to look in certain places, never considered that a man who'd spent years searching for gold veins might know ways up sheer rock faces that others would miss. Morrison placed his resources as carefully as Carson had placed his, men, preparing for a very different kind of battle than the one his enemy expected. By mid-morning, the tension in the canyon was palpable. Carson's men had spotted signs of Morrison's movement, but couldn't pin down his location. Their professional calm was beginning to show cracks, too many false alarms, too many shadows that might hide a deadly shot from Wade's Colt. Morrison watched through his spyglass as Carson emerged from his tent, scanning the canyon with the confidence of a man who believed he controlled the battlefield. The morning sun glinted off his fancy vest buttons and the polished handles of his matched pistols. Even here, preparing for murder, he maintained the appearance of civilization. "You're not hiding anymore, are you?" Carson called out, his cultured voice echoing off the canyon walls. "You heard our discussion last night. Good. I prefer it when everyone understands their part in the story." Morrison stayed silent, noting how Carson's men responded to their employer's voice. They were too professional to show obvious concern, but their subtle shifts in position told him everything he needed to know. They weren't just worried about Morrison now. They were wondering what other secrets their employer might be hiding. "It can still end simply," Carson continued. "The past is the past. Golden Creek, Wade, all of it. None of it matters anymore. I'm willing to be generous, to offer you a place in what I'm building. After all, a man with your talents." Morrison's hand tightened on Wade's gun. Carson was trying to seed doubt, to turn this into a negotiation. But some things weren't negotiable. The dead of Golden Creek deserved better than to have their murders hidden under Carson's ambition. The time for waiting was almost over. Morrison touched the marshal's badge in his pocket, feeling the weight of responsibility it represented. Wade had died trying to bring Carson to justice. Now it fell to his last student to finish what the marshal had started. The morning wind carried the smell of lamp oil downstream, a precursor to the violence to come. Morrison allowed himself a grim smile. Carson had orchestrated one massacre through manipulation and lies. Now he would face a different kind of opponent. A man with nothing left to lose, and a dead man's gun that demanded justice. The first shot came at noon, when the sun hung directly overhead, and shadows all but disappeared in the canyon. It wasn't from Wade's Colt or any of Carson's men. It was the sharp crack of Morrison's Remington, sending a bullet into a strategically placed bottle of lamp oil near one of the sniper positions. The explosion wasn't large, but in the enclosed canyon, its effect was devastating. Smoke and flame erupted along the ridge, forcing Carson's sharpshooter to abandon his perfect position. The man's scramble for safety drew reactive fire from his own companions, who mistook his movement for an attack. "Hold your fire," Carson's command cut through the chaos, but the damage was done. His carefully organized defense had been disrupted by a single shot, and now smoke was obscuring crucial sightlines. Morrison was moving before the echo of the explosion died, using the confusion to slip between the rocks like a shadow. Wade's gun remained holstered. This part of the battle would be won through positioning rather than shooting. The marshal had taught him that winning a fight often meant controlling where it took place. Judge played his part perfectly, breaking free from his reins at the sound of the explosion and bolting past Carson's position. The mule's sudden appearance drew instinctive attention and fire, creating more confusion as Carson's men tried to determine if the animal was a threat or a distraction. "It's a diversion!" Carson shouted, his military training recognizing the tactic. "Watch the high ground." But Morrison wasn't on the high ground. He was moving through spaces between spaces, using routes that only a miner would see. The canyon walls weren't just rock to him. They were a maze of opportunities, each crack and crevice a potential path. The second explosion came from the opposite ridge, another carefully placed bottle, turning a defensive position into a death trap. This time, Carson's men showed more discipline, maintaining their positions despite the smoke and confusion. But discipline didn't help them watch everywhere at once. Morrison's voice echoed off the canyon walls, seeming to come from multiple directions at once. "Tell them, Carson. Tell your men what really happened to the gold from the assay office." "He's trying to divide us," Carson called back, but there was an edge to his cultured voice now. "Stay focused. He has to be running low on ammunition." A third explosion turned that claim to ash, along with another of Carson's carefully chosen positions. Now the canyon was filled with drifting smoke, making it impossible for the remaining men to maintain visual contact with each other. Professional discipline began to fray as each man realized they were facing an opponent who had turned the entire canyon into a weapon. "Your brother wasn't the only one you sacrificed." Morrison's voice came again, closer this time. "How many of your own men died in Golden Creek to keep your secret?" "Don't listen to him," Carson commanded, but his men were already exchanging glances. The seeds of doubt had been planted, and the smoke gave them time to grow. Morrison's strategic shots, not from Wade's gun, but from the Remington, picked at the edges of Carson's defense. Not trying to kill, but forcing men to move, to second-guess their positions, to question their choices. The canyon filled with gun smoke and uncertainty, each man feeling increasingly isolated despite their numbers. "Look around you," Morrison called out. "You're not fighting for justice or revenge. You're dying to help a man hide his crimes. Is that worth the price he's paying you? The first of Carson's remaining men broke formation then, using the smoke as cover to slip away from the fight. Others followed, professional judgment telling them that no payment was worth dying in a trap they couldn't escape. Carson's curses followed them, his civilized facade cracking under the pressure of failing plans. Cowards! Carson's voice was rough now, all trace of Eastern refinement gone. Stand and fight, but standing and fighting was exactly what Morrison had made impossible. The entire canyon had become a deadly maze of smoke and shifting shadows, where every shot might come from friend or foe. Carson's careful strategic planning meant nothing now. This was a prospector's game, fought in the spaces between solid rock. Through the drifting smoke, Morrison caught glimpses of Carson spinning in place, matched pistols drawn, trying to track a phantom that attacked from everywhere and nowhere. The man's expensive clothes were stained with dust and sweat, his military bearing giving way to desperate survival instinct. Morrison touched Wade's gun, still holstered, still waiting. Its time would come, but not yet. First, Carson needed to understand what it meant to be truly alone, surrounded by enemies he couldn't see, just like the citizens of Golden Creek had been on that blood-soaked morning 5 years ago. The smoke began to clear with the afternoon wind, revealing what Morrison's strategy had wrought. Carson stood alone in the canyon center, his matched pistols glinting in the sun. His fine coat was torn, his face streaked with soot and desperation. All pretense of the civilized businessman had burned away with his men's loyalty. "Come out and face me," Carson's voice cracked with rage. "Or are you going to hide in the rocks like a snake?" Morrison emerged from the smoke like a ghost, Wade's Colt finally drawn, but held loose at his side. He moved with the easy confidence of a man who had already won, each step measured and deliberate. "Wasn't hiding, Carson. Just making sure we could talk private-like." Morrison stopped 30 paces away, a distance that Wade had once told him separated the quick from the dead. "About Golden Creek, about the gold, about your brother." Carson's matched pistols tracked Morrison's movement. The man's hands were steady despite his disheveled appearance, a reminder that beneath the Eastern manners lurked a killer. "There's nothing to talk about. You're a relic, Morrison, a ghost that should have died with that miserable town." "Town wasn't miserable before you decided to use it." Morrison's voice carried the weight of 5 years of buried truth. "Marshal Wade figured it out, didn't he? That's why he had to die. He knew the Hawkins gang was just a convenient excuse." Wade was a fool. Carson's smile was sharp as broken glass, poking into business that didn't concern him, just like you're doing now. But I've learned from that mistake. This time, there won't be any witnesses. Morrison's hand rested near Wade's Colt, feeling the smooth pearl grip that had absorbed the blood and wisdom of 3 generations of lawmen. "Your brother's death was an accident. The rest was just you, turning tragedy into opportunity. How long had you been planning it? How many deaths did it take to hide your theft? You don't understand anything." Carson's cultured accent slipped, revealing the ruthless ambition beneath. "Golden Creek was dying anyway. I just helped it along, turned its death into something useful. The gold was wasted sitting in that assay office. I put it to work building something bigger, building an empire on dead men's graves, better than scratching in the dirt like you miners." Carson's eyes narrowed. "I offered you a chance, Morrison. Could have had a place in what I'm creating, but you're like Wade, too stubborn to see the bigger picture." Morrison's quiet laugh held no humor. "Wade saw the picture clear enough, saw what kind of man you really were. That's why he gave me his gun." "That gun." Carson's gaze fixed on the pearl-handled Colt. 5 years I've wondered what Wade told you before he died. What evidence he passed on, But he didn't tell you anything, did he? He just gave you his gun and died, leaving you to carry his crusade without even knowing why. He knew you'd never stop looking over your shoulder as long as his gun was out there." Morrison's voice was soft, but it carried to every corner of the canyon. "Knew you'd eventually make a mistake. Try to tie off that last loose end." Carson's laugh was ugly. "And now here we are. 2 men and 3 guns, about to add more bodies to a story that should have ended years ago." "Story's ending today," Morrison agreed, "but not the way you think." The air grew heavy with tension as both men measured the space between them. 30 paces, the same distance that had separated Marshall Wade from his killer 5 years ago. "Last chance, Morrison." Carson's matched pistols gleamed with deadly promise. "Walk away. Take your suspicions and your dead man's gun somewhere far from here. Living's better than dying for a cause you barely understand." Morrison's hand hovered near Wade's Colt, remembering all the lessons that had led to this moment. "You're wrong about one thing, Carson. I understand just fine. Wade taught me everything I needed to know about justice, about responsibility, about making every bullet count." The wind died. The canyon held its breath. 2 men faced each other across 30 paces of blood-soaked history, each knowing that only one would walk away. In the distance, Judge watched impassively, having seen such moments before. Carson's fingers tensed on his fancy pistols. Morrison's hand stayed loose near Wade's gun. The sun crept toward the canyon rim, marking the last moments of a story 5 years in the making. Carson moved first, his matched pistols rising with practiced speed. The canyon erupted with the thunder of his first shots, bullets cutting the air where Morrison had been standing. But Morrison was already moving, his draw so smooth it seemed, almost casual in comparison. Wade's Colt spoke once, a deep authoritative bark that echoed off the canyon walls. Carson's left pistol went flying, taking 2 fingers with it. Before his scream could fade, Morrison's second shot struck Carson's remaining gun, shattering both weapon and hand with surgical precision. Carson stumbled backward, staring at his ruined hands in disbelief. All his careful planning, his strategic brilliance, had been undone by 2 shots from a dead man's gun. "How?" he gasped through the pain. "Those shots. Impossible." Not impossible. Morrison kept Wade's Colt trained on Carson as he closed the distance. "Just justice, delivered, with the patience you never had. This is for the people of Golden Creek. Wait!" Carson's cultured accent cracked with desperation. "The gold. I can tell you where it is. All of it. We can split it, make a deal." Morrison's expression didn't change. "Already know where it is. Found your cache in the old Silver Queen mine last year? Wade's letters led me right to it." "Letters?" Blood drained from Carson's face. "What letters?" "The ones that don't exist." Morrison's voice was cold as mountain snow. "But you just confirmed what Wade suspected. The Silver Queen was the only, a mine deep enough to hide that much gold, only place that made sense." Carson sagged as he realized his final mistake. 5 years of looking over his shoulder, wondering what evidence Wade had left behind, and he'd broken himself on a simple trick. "So, what now? Going to kill me? Become judge, jury, and executioner?" "No." Morrison's next words fell like hammer blows. "You're going to trial, going to face the families of everyone who died in Golden Creek, going to watch while your empire crumbles, and your name becomes nothing but a cautionary tale." "I won't talk." Carson tried to summon his old arrogance. "You can't prove anything. Don't need to prove it." Morrison drew Wade's badge from his coat with his left hand, letting it catch the sun. "Found enough evidence in your camp to connect you to a dozen other crimes. Army patrols are already headed to your properties, following tips about stolen gold. Your empire's already falling, Carson. You just don't know it yet." The sound that escaped Carson was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. Wade's badge too. You've been planning this for years, haven't you? While I was hunting you, you were hunting me. Difference is, Morrison said quietly, I learned patience from better men than you. Learned about justice from Wade, about persistence, from every miner who ever followed a vein into the dark. As if summoned by his words, the thunder of approaching horses echoed through the canyon. Carson's head snapped up, hope warring with fear on his face. But Morrison didn't even twitch. That'll be the Army patrol, he said calmly, right on time. Had Judge carried the message to them this morning while your men were watching the wrong trail. Horse runs faster without a saddle. Carson looked at the approaching riders, then at his ruined hands, and finally at Wade's colt, still trained, unwavering. On his chest, all his schemes, his careful manipulations, had led him right into a trap 5 years in the making. You're more than just some miner with a dead man's gun, he said finally, the last pieces falling into place. Wade was training. You all along, wasn't he? Getting you ready to take his place. Morrison didn't answer. He didn't need to. The truth was there in his stance, in the way he handled Wade's gun, in the patient justice he delivered with 2 perfect shots. The Army patrol clattered into the canyon, rifles ready, but the fight was already over. As they took Carson into custody, Morrison finally holstered Wade's Colt. The pearl grips were warm against his hip, carrying the weight of promises kept and justice served. Judge ambled over, seemingly unimpressed by the dramatic conclusion. Morrison patted the mule's neck, remembering all the trails that had led to this moment. The dead of Golden Creek could rest easier now, knowing their killer would face judgment. Wade's last case was finally closed, his legacy honored by the student he'd chosen. The sun touched the canyon rim as Morrison mounted up. Behind him, Carson's protests faded into the distance, carrying away the last echoes of Golden Creek's tragedy. Wade's gun rode easy on his hip, its work complete, but its lessons eternal. Sometimes justice came swift as lightning, and sometimes it took 5 years of patient planning, but it always came one way or another. 2 weeks after Carson's capture, Morrison stood in the remains of Golden Creek. The town was slowly being reclaimed by nature, weathered buildings telling silent stories of lives interrupted. But it felt different now. The heavy weight of unfinished business that had haunted these streets for 5 years had finally lifted. News of Carson's arrest had spread quickly through the territories. His empire had crumbled exactly as Morrison had predicted, its foundations built on too many lies to survive scrutiny. The stolen gold had been recovered from the Silver Queen mine, bringing closure to families who had lost everything in the massacre. Morrison walked the familiar path to where Marshal Wade had fallen. Someone, probably the Army patrol that had helped arrest Carson, had placed a simple wooden cross to mark the spot. Morrison touched the pearl grip of Wade's gun, remembering the weight of responsibility that had passed to him with it. You were right all along, he told the cross quietly, about justice being patient, about making every bullet count. The gun would have new work soon. The Army commander had offered Morrison a marshal's badge of his own, acknowledging what Wade had seen in him years ago. Judge waited patiently as Morrison made his peace with the ghosts of Golden Creek. The mule had been with him through it all. The massacre, the long years of preparation, and finally the delivery of justice. Some might say a man couldn't be friends with a mule, but they'd never spent 5 years hunting truth across hard country. As the sun began to set, Morrison mounted up for the last time as just a miner. Tomorrow he'd pin on a badge and begin a new chapter, carrying Wade's lessons to other territories that needed patient justice. The weight of the pearl-handled Colt at his hip felt right now, its purpose aligned with its history. Golden Creek would never be rebuilt. Too many painful memories stained its soil. But as Morrison rode away, He knew the dead could rest easier. Carson would face trial for his crimes, and the truth of what happened here would finally be known. Sometimes, Morrison reflected, that was the most important kind of justice. Not just punishment, but understanding. The setting sun caught the silver star pattern on his holster, the same design that had once graced Wade's badge. The dead man's gun had finished its work here, but there would be other cases, other wrongs that needed righting. Morrison touched the grip one last time as he rode into the gathering darkness, ready to carry its legacy forward. Behind him, Golden. Greek settled into its final sleep, its ghosts finally at peace. A month later, a different kind of tale began spreading through frontier towns. Stories of a new marshal who carried a pearl-handled Colt and rode with a contrary mule. They said he moved like a shadow through troubled territories, bringing a patient kind of justice to those who thought themselves above the law. Some claimed he was Wade's last student. Others said he was just another hard man with a badge. But everyone agreed on one thing. When the marshal's gun spoke, it spoke with purpose. Each bullet carried the weight of history, each shot delivered with the precision of a man who understood the responsibility he carried. In time, people would forget about Golden Creek and Marcus Carson, but they would remember the marshal with the dead man's gun and the lesson he taught about justice being patient but certain.